She may look charming, romantic, spontaneous, and full of feeling, but the woman who never grows up is usually running from one thing above all else: adult reality. This pattern is not about liking fun, youth, beauty, or romance, because a mature woman can keep all of those and still live with responsibility. The deeper issue is evasion, meaning she avoids adult accountability, adult reciprocity, and the hard task of building a self that can stand without rescue. That is why the pattern can look attractive on the outside while creating wreckage underneath in money, relationships, work, and emotional stability. When people hear a title like this, they often picture a silly woman who hates bills, but the psychology is more serious than that cartoon. The real pattern usually shows up as financial dependence, validation dependence, commitment avoidance, and a constant attempt to keep life open, ideal, and consequence-free. By the end of this video, you will see the common signs, the likely roots, and the growth tasks that turn the eternal girl into an adult woman. One of the clearest signs appears in money, long before it appears in speech, because dependence usually leaves receipts. She may move from parents to partners to friends without building stable self-support, or she may talk about future plans without doing the repetitive work those plans require. That gap matters because adulthood is not proven by beautiful intentions. Adulthood is proven by structure, follow-through, and the ability to carry your own weight over time. The fantasy version says she is still finding herself, still waiting for the right season, still one perfect opportunity away from becoming who she really is. The real version often looks like unpaid bills, unfinished training, unstable housing, and a life held together by somebody else's labor. That does not always mean obvious helplessness, because some women present as stylish, clever, and psychologically fluent while staying dependent underneath the performance. She can sound independent and still depend on charm, crisis, seduction, or chronic indecision to keep others carrying the practical burden. That hidden dependence is why people around her often feel drained before they can explain why. Financial responsibility matters here because earning, budgeting, tolerating boredom, and following through convert identity from a wish into a working system. Without that structure, the self stays dreamy, dramatic, and fragile because reality never has to test it. A second sign shows up in the hunger to be chosen because some women build self-worth around being admired, rescued, desired, or reassured. Validation dependence can make every relationship feel heavier than it should, since love is no longer love alone. It becomes proof that she exists and matters. That pressure usually creates unstable bonds because no partner can keep supplying endless confirmation without eventually feeling used or overwhelmed. When approval drops, panic often rises, and the woman may disappear, dramatize, triangulate, or create a crisis that forces attention back onto her. She may know the language of therapy, attachment, boundaries, and trauma, yet still expect other people to absorb the consequences of her emotional swings. That distinction is important because insight about feelings is not the same thing as regulation of feelings. A person can describe her wounds beautifully and still live as if everyone nearby must become her nervous system. The third sign is more hidden because it hides inside romance itself, and that sign is commitment avoidance dressed as idealism. She may adore the fantasy of love while pulling away when love becomes ordinary, structured, and reciprocal. Dating can feel thrilling because possibility remains endless, but commitment can feel like symbolic death because choosing one path means losing all the imagined others. That is why some women cycle through unstable romances, unfinished engagements, and a constant search for a perfect partner who never quite arrives. The problem is not that real love lacks excitement. The problem is that real love includes repetition, compromise, and the death of fantasy. For the woman who never grew up, that death of fantasy can feel more frightening than loneliness itself. Attachment theory helps explain why this happens, because old fear often contaminates adult closeness long before she understands it. Anxious attachment can make her desperate for reassurance, terrified of abandonment, and over-invested in romance as proof of worth. Avoidant attachment can create the opposite surface, where she talks about intimacy beautifully, but retreats once intimacy becomes real, mutual, and inescapably ordinary. Disorganized attachment can combine both patterns, creating chaotic relationships full of hunger, fear, pursuit, flight, and emotional addiction. In all three cases, adult love stops feeling safe, so fantasy or dependency starts feeling easier than true mutuality. Family systems add another layer because some women did not become dependent by choice. They were trained into it by the homes that shaped them. Overprotective or intrusive parents often rescue too quickly, worry too loudly, and quietly teach a daughter that the world is dangerous and she is fragile. Research on overprotective parenting links it with dependence, enmeshment, impaired autonomy, and vulnerability-based thinking later in life. If a girl never practices enough frustration, separation, failure, and recovery, adulthood can feel less like freedom and more like exposure. She may not consciously want to remain childlike. She may simply have no sturdy inner memory of surviving adult responsibility on her own. Another path looks different but leads to a similar outcome, and that path is overindulgence. If a child is excessively praised without limits, protected from consequences, or treated as exceptional in a way that weakens frustration tolerance, adulthood can feel insulting. Rules feel unfair, work feels beneath her, compromise feels restrictive, and mutuality feels like a downgrade from the fantasy she was promised. That version may look less needy at first, yet it can become entitled, dismissive, restless, and permanently disappointed that life is not arranging itself around her inner image. This is where the Jungian image of the Puella Aeterna becomes useful, because it gives a name to the eternal girl hidden inside the adult woman. The Puella Aeterna is organized around youth, seduction, possibility, and resistance to limitation, not around ordinary work, ordinary time, or ordinary consequence. She wants the poetry of becoming without the discipline of being, and that sentence explains more than 100 shallow insults ever could. She prefers the perfect imagined self, the perfect partner, the perfect vocation, and the perfect future to the repetitive labor required to build any imperfect real version. That is why arrested development is often a defense against mourning. To choose one career is to lose all the unlived careers. To choose one partner is to lose all the imagined lovers. And to grow up is to accept time. Fear of failure powers this pattern too, because unfinished life protects the ideal self from the humiliation of contact with reality. As long as she has not truly committed, she has not truly failed, and the fantasy of future greatness can stay untouched. That is why procrastination, serial reinvention, unstable careers, unfinished projects, and romantic cycling often appear together in the same life. Culture can hide the problem by rewarding prolonged adolescence, especially in environments where youthfulness, emotional intensity, and constant reinvention are praised. For women, social approval can become tied to desirability and performance so strongly that grounded adulthood starts to look dull even when it is healthier. Still, this idea becomes lazy and cruel if it turns into an insult for every unconventional woman. A mature woman can delay marriage, change careers, live creatively, need family help during a hard season, and still remain accountable for consequences. The real distinction is not conventional versus unconventional. It is conscious choice with responsibility versus chronic avoidance with transfer of burden onto others. So how does someone outgrow this pattern if she recognizes herself inside it? The first step is naming the payoff of staying undeveloped, because the payoff may be safety, specialness, rescue, exemption from grief, or exemption from failure. Once the hidden payoff becomes visible, the pattern loses some of its mystery and starts looking like a strategy with a cost. The second step is building tolerable doses of autonomy instead of waiting to feel ready first. Confidence usually follows repeated action, not the other way around, which means adulthood is practiced into the nervous system through small acts of self-support. The third step is treating money as psychological work, not just logistical work, because budgets, deadlines, and boring tasks train a self to become real. The fourth step is relationship work through attachment-based therapy, schema work, or psychodynamic work that uncovers how dependence and idealization first developed. The fifth step is frustration tolerance, because grown-up life includes routine, compromise, delayed gratification, paperwork, repetition, and sometimes the burial of fantasy. Resenting those facts keeps the psyche infantile, while accepting them creates freedom that feels less glamorous and far more stable. The healthiest endpoint is not a grim woman with no play left in her at all. The healthiest endpoint is a woman who keeps curiosity, erotic vitality, tenderness, imagination, and play while also gaining self-support, commitment, repair, and responsibility. That is the real cure for the eternal girl, not the death of aliveness, but the marriage of aliveness to reality. If you want the next psychology breakdown on attachment patterns that quietly shape adult love, subscribe so you do not miss the follow-up. There is another sign worth noticing, and it appears in the unstable way she defines herself. One month she is certain she has found her calling. The next month she has discarded it for a completely different future that also stays mostly imagined. This constant reinvention can look exciting from the outside, yet it often hides terror of being ordinary long enough to become competent. A finished path can be judged. An unfinished path can stay magical forever. That is why the woman who never grows up often protects possibility more fiercely than she protects progress. She would rather remain potentially brilliant than become measurably average at the beginning of real work. Another common pattern is rescue dependence during stress. When life becomes administratively heavy, she may wait for a parent, partner, or friend to restore order instead of building her own stabilizing habits. The rescue may be emotional, financial, logistical, or all three at once. She may not ask directly every time. Sometimes she creates enough confusion, fragility, or urgency that someone steps in automatically. Over years, that trains everyone around her into parent roles and leaves romance feeling strangely maternal or managerial. The shame underneath this pattern is often deeper than outsiders realize. Many women caught in arrested development secretly know life is moving on without them. They may envy peers with stable homes, finished projects, and durable commitments, while outwardly mocking those same lives as boring or conventional. That split between envy and contempt can become psychologically corrosive. It protects pride in the short term and deepens self-contempt in the long term. Growth usually begins when fantasy stops being treated as identity and starts being tested against behavior. Can she keep a promise when the work is repetitive? Can she tolerate being bad at something long enough to improve? Can she stay present after romance loses its cinematic glow and becomes a shared routine full of laundry, fatigue, and repair? Can she earn trust rather than audition for admiration? These are adult questions because they measure reality contact, not self-image. That is also why therapy helps most when it moves beyond explanation into practice. Naming father wounds, attachment wounds, or enmeshment wounds can open the door. But maturity arrives when new actions are repeated until the nervous system learns that autonomy, boredom, and limitation are survivable. In practical terms, that can mean paying her own bills on time for a year, finishing one project before starting 3 new ones, and stopping the habit of disappearing when conflict arrives. It can mean apologizing without drama, making a budget without feeling humiliated, and choosing one life-giving commitment even though 10 imaginary alternatives still glitter in the background. Those choices are not glamorous. They are developmental. And developmental work is what finally turns a forever girl into a woman whose freedom is real instead of borrowed. There is also a grief task inside maturity that many eternal girl patterns avoid for years. A grown life requires accepting that time closes doors, beauty changes, chances narrow, and not every imagined self will be lived. When that grief is refused, the woman keeps circling fantasy because fantasy never asks her to bury the unlived versions of herself. When that grief is faced, commitment stops feeling like death and starts feeling like authorship. She is no longer waiting to be discovered. She is choosing what she will build with the one life that is actually hers. That shift often looks plain from the outside. Inside, it is one of the deepest psychological changes adulthood can ask for. In that sense, maturity is less about age than about tolerated reality. The grown woman can survive boredom, limits, imperfection, and accountability without needing fantasy or rescue to soften every impact. She can disappoint herself, repair, and keep going. That resilience is what the woman who never grew up still has to build. The woman who matures does not lose sparkle. She learns how to carry sparkle without asking somebody else to carry her. That is the adult exchange she must learn. No rescue, no performance, just a real self strong enough to remain present in real life. That is when growth stops being a theory and becomes a lived adult shape.